The winter of 1692 was the harshest Massachusetts had seen in living memory. Snow piled higher than a man's waist against the stone walls of St. Bartholomew's Chapel, and the wind howled through the pine forests like the voices of the damned.
If you love powerful stories full of twists, deep emotions, and unforgettable characters, subscribe now and turn on the bell.
I tell you this not to paint a pretty picture, but because you must understand the cold. The kind that seeps into your bones and makes you question whether spring will ever come again. My name is Tobias Blackwood, and I was once a knight in service. To the crown, once, mind you. By the time this tale begins, I was nothing more than a broken man seeking absolution in the new world, carrying sins heavier than the armor I'd long since abandoned. I had come to the colonies not for opportunity or freedom, as so many others did, but to disappear entirely, to become no one, in a place where no one knew my name or the blood that stained my hands. The chapel where I sought refuge was as forgotten as I was, built by some long-dead Puritan minister with more ambition than congregation. It sat 3 miles from the nearest settlement of Millbrook, connected only by a treacherous path that wound through dense woodland. The good reverend had died of fever before his first winter, and the chapel had stood empty for near a decade when I claimed it as my hermitage. I had been living there for 2 months, surviving on what little game I could trap and the meager supplies I'd managed to purchase in town before the snows made travel impossible. Each day blended into the next: prayer, meditation, the endless task of keeping the fire burning and the cold at bay. I welcomed the isolation. It gave me time to think, to remember, to try to make sense of what I had become. It was on the morning of December 14th that everything changed. I woke before dawn, as was my custom, to the sound of wind rattling the chapel's ancient timbers. But beneath that familiar howling, I heard something else, a sound so faint I nearly dismissed it as imagination. A cry, weak, pitiful, but undeniably human. I dressed quickly and pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the cold hitting me like a physical blow. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a landscape transformed into crystalline perfection. Every branch, every stone was sheathed in ice that caught the first pale light of dawn and threw it back in 1,000 glittering fragments. The crying came again, clearer now, and I followed the sound around to the chapel's eastern wall. There, in a basket woven from willow branches and lined with what had once been a fine woolen blanket, lay a child. She could not have been more than 2 years old. Her skin was blue-white with cold, her tiny fists clenched against the bitter air. The blanket that should have protected her was frozen stiff, and ice crystals had formed in her dark hair. By all rights, she should have been dead. By all logic of this harsh world, she should have perished hours ago, but she lived. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, and her eyes, Lord help me, her eyes, opened as I knelt beside the basket. They were the deepest brown I had ever seen, like pools of warm chocolate, and they looked up at me with such trust, such hope, that I felt something crack inside my chest that had been frozen for years. I scooped her up, basket and all, and carried her inside. The chapel's interior was scarcely warmer than the outdoors, but at least it was free from the cutting wind. I stoked the fire until it roared, then carefully unwrapped the child from her icy shroud. She was a beautiful little thing, despite her ordeal. Her features spoke of mixed heritage, the delicate bone structure and olive complexion suggesting Spanish or perhaps Portuguese blood mixed with English. In these times, in these colonies, such ancestry could mean only one thing. She was the product of a union deemed improper by society's rigid standards. As I warmed her by the fire, wrapping her in my own blankets and coaxing life back into her tiny limbs, I found myself studying her face. There was something familiar about it, though I could not place what. Perhaps it was simply the universal innocence of childhood, or perhaps it was something more. She did not cry as I tended to her, which worried me more than tears would have. Children who have suffered greatly sometimes retreat into silence, and I feared what trauma this little one might have already endured. But when I offered her sips of warm broth made from rabbit bones, she drank eagerly, and when I spoke to her, In gentle tones, she watched me with those remarkable eyes. "What shall I call you, little one?" I asked, though I expected no answer. "Someone left you here for a reason. Perhaps they knew this old chapel still sheltered a soul or two." It was. Then I noticed the piece of parchment tucked beneath her in the basket. The paper was of fine quality, though dampened by the snow. Written in a careful hand were only a few words. "Her name is Isabella. She is innocent of all sins but those of her birth. Please, if there is mercy in your heart, protect her." Isabella. It was a name that carried the weight of Spanish nobility, wholly at odds with her abandonment in this frozen wilderness. I looked down at the child, at Isabella, and felt something I had not experienced in years. Purpose, the stirring of an emotion I thought I had lost forever in the blood and mud of English battlefields. You see, I had been a knight in service to King James before William of Orange took the throne. I had fought in Ireland, putting down Catholic rebellions with a ruthlessness that haunts me still. I had burned villages, scattered families, and convinced myself it was all in service to God and crown. But when James fled to France and William's Protestant rule was established, men like me, Catholic knights who had served the old king, found ourselves suddenly without place or purpose. Some fled to France with James, others converted and bent the knee to William. I chose a third path, exile to the New World, carrying with me the weight of every life I had taken in the name of duty. Finding Isabella changed everything. Here was innocence abandoned, vulnerability made manifest. Here was a chance for redemption I had never thought to find. If I could not undo the harm I had caused, perhaps I could prevent it from touching this one small life. The first challenge was simply keeping her alive. Infants require constant care, and I was woefully unprepared for such responsibility. I had never married, never had children of my own. My life had been one of warfare and wandering, with no room for the tender considerations of child-rearing, but necessity proved a capable teacher. I learned to warm goat's milk over the fire and feed it to her with a carved wooden spoon. I discovered that the sound of my voice, reading aloud from the Bible or simply telling stories, would calm her when she grew restless. I found that she slept best when wrapped close to my chest, where she could hear my heartbeat and feel the warmth of my body. The isolation that had once been my refuge now became my greatest challenge. With no other soul for miles, I had no one to turn to for advice or assistance. Everything I learned came through trial and error, with Isabella's very life hanging in the balance of my inexperience. There were moments of pure terror, when she developed a fever that burned through her tiny body for 3 days, or when she refused to eat for so long that I feared she was fading away. In those dark hours, I prayed with a fervor I had not felt since my youth, begging God to spare this innocent child from the failures of the world around her. But there were also moments of unexpected joy. The first time she smiled at me, a toothless grin that transformed her entire face. The way she would reach for me when I approached, her small hands grasping at my beard or the rough cloth of my shirt. The musical quality of her laugh when I made faces or told her silly stories. As winter deepened, I began to understand that this was no temporary arrangement. Isabella was not some lost child who would soon be reclaimed by worried parents. She had been deliberately abandoned, left in a place where only chance, or perhaps divine providence, had brought her to my attention. The more I considered her circumstances, the more questions arose. Who were her parents? Why had they chosen this particular chapel for her abandonment? How had they known that someone would find her before the cold claimed her life? The note suggested they knew something of my character, perhaps even my presence in this place. But as days turned to weeks, these questions seemed less important than the simple reality of caring for Isabella. She was growing stronger, more alert, more responsive to my presence. She had begun to babble in the way of children, creating her own language of sounds and gestures that somehow made perfect sense to me. I found myself changing as well. The bitter solitude that had defined my existence began to give way to something warmer, more purposeful. Isabella's needs created a structure to my days that had been lacking. Her presence filled the chapel with life in a way that no amount of prayer or meditation had achieved. When the first thaw came in March, I faced a decision that would define both our futures. I could take Isabella to the settlement at Millbrook, turn her over to the care of the community, and resume my hermit's existence. It would have been the sensible thing, perhaps even the right thing. A child needed more than one man could provide, especially a man with my history, but the thought of losing her filled me with a pain I had not expected. She had become my daughter in every way that mattered, and I could not bear the thought of strangers raising her, of her growing up not knowing that someone had chosen to love her despite the circumstances of her birth. Instead, I made a different choice. I would claim her as my own, create a new life for both of us in this new world where a man could reinvent himself if he had the courage to do so. The first step was practical: supplies. My winter stores were nearly exhausted, and Isabella's needs had grown as she developed. I would need to make contact with the outside world, to establish myself as a member of the community rather than a mysterious hermit. I fashioned a sling to carry Isabella against my chest and set out for Millbrook on the first clear day of spring. The journey that had once taken me 2 hours now stretched to 4, as I stopped frequently to tend to her needs and ensure she was comfortable. The settlement was larger than I remembered, perhaps 50 souls living in a collection of log cabins and frame houses clustered around a central green. The sight of a gruff, bearded stranger carrying an infant drew immediate attention, and I soon found myself surrounded by curious neighbors. "Name's Tobias Blackwood," I announced to the assembled crowd. "I've been living in the old chapel through the winter. This is my daughter Isabella." The lie came easier than I had expected, perhaps because, in all the ways that truly mattered, it was not a lie at all. An elderly woman with kind eyes stepped forward and peered at Isabella, who gazed back with her usual solemn attention. "She's a beautiful child," the woman said. "But she looks to have some foreign blood in her. Spanish, perhaps?" "Her mother was Spanish," I replied, sticking close to the truth. "She died in childbirth. I've been caring for Isabella alone since." It was a story that would satisfy curiosity without inviting too many questions. Widowed fathers were not uncommon in the colonies, and the harsh realities of childbirth made maternal death a frequent tragedy. The community accepted us with the cautious welcome extended to all newcomers. I purchased supplies, arranged for regular deliveries of milk and grain, and even found work helping to clear land for new settlers. My experience with military engineering proved useful in planning defensive positions and constructing sturdy buildings. Most importantly, I found women willing to help with Isabella's care. Goodwife Martha, the elderly woman who had first approached us, proved especially helpful. She taught me the finer points of child rearing, from preparing proper foods to recognizing the signs of illness. "She's a bright one," Martha observed, during one of her visits to the chapel. Isabella, now nearly 3, was attempting to build a tower from wooden blocks I had carved for her. "Mark my words, Tobias, this child will surprise you with what she's capable of." Isabella was indeed developing in remarkable ways. Her vocabulary grew daily, and she displayed an unusual curiosity about everything around her. She would spend hours examining flowers, insects, or simple household objects with the intensity of a natural philosopher. Her questions were endless. Why is the sky blue? Where do birds go at night? What makes the fire burn? I did my best to answer, drawing on my education and experience to provide explanations suitable for a young mind. But often, her questions pushed me to consider things I had never thought about deeply, forcing me to admit the limits of my own knowledge. As Isabella grew, so did my connection to the community. I was elected to serve on the town council, helped establish a school for the children, and even began leading occasional services at the chapel when the circuit preacher could not make the journey from Boston. But it was my relationship with Isabella that truly transformed me. The hardened soldier who had arrived in the New World seeking only to escape his past had become a father, a teacher, a man who looked forward to each day rather than simply enduring it. Isabella, for her part, seemed to have no memory of her earliest days or any sense that our relationship was anything other than natural. She called me Papa with absolute confidence, and I responded with a love I had never known I was capable of feeling. When she was 4, Isabella began asking about her mother. I had always known this day would come, and I had prepared for it, as best I could. Your mama was a beautiful lady from a faraway place called Spain, I told her one evening as we sat before the fire. She loved you very much, but she got sick and went to be with God before you were old enough to remember her. Do I look like her? Isabella asked, touching her own face with her small hands. You have her eyes, I said, which was true enough. And her smile. She would be very proud of the clever, kind girl you've become. It was a sanitized version of the truth, but it was all a child her age could understand. As she grew older, I would share more details, help her understand her heritage and the circumstances that had brought us together. But for now, it was enough that she felt loved and secure. The years that followed were the happiest of my life. I watched Isabella grow from a curious toddler into a bright, confident child. She learned to read from the Bible and the few other books I possessed. She helped me in the garden, tended to injured animals she found in the forest, and charmed every visitor to our chapel home. Her mixed heritage, which I had once feared would cause problems, actually proved to be an advantage. The Spanish features I had worried about were exotic enough to be considered striking rather than problematic. Several families in the settlement had similar stories of foreign-born mothers, and Isabella was accepted without question as one of their own. But I knew that questions would eventually arise. As Isabella approached her 7th birthday, she began to notice differences between herself and the other children. Her skin was darker, her hair curlier, her features more delicate. She was also more advanced in her learning, reading at a level well beyond her years and displaying an aptitude for languages that amazed even me. It was then that I decided to tell her the truth about how she had come to be my daughter. We were sitting together in the chapel one autumn evening, Isabella reading aloud from Pilgrim's Progress while I mended a tear in her dress. The firelight flickered across her face, highlighting the intelligence in her dark eyes and the determined set of her chin. Isabella, I said, setting down my needle and thread. There's something important I need to tell you about the day we first met. She looked up from her book, sensing the seriousness in my tone. What is it, Papa? You know that I've always told you that you're my daughter, and that's true in every way that matters. But you didn't come to me the way most children come to their parents. I told her the story then, leaving out nothing appropriate for a child her age to know. I described finding her in the basket, the note that had accompanied her, the decision to raise her as my own. Throughout the telling, Isabella listened with the same focused attention she brought to everything that interested her. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, So my real parents didn't want me? I don't think that's true, I said carefully. I think they loved you very much, but they were in a situation where they couldn't take care of you properly. They brought you to a place where they knew you would be safe and loved. But you chose to keep me, she said, even though you didn't have to. Yes, I replied. I chose to keep you because I couldn't imagine my life without you in it. Isabella nodded thoughtfully, then returned to her book. I'm glad they left me where you could find me, she said simply. I like being your daughter. That conversation marked a turning point in our relationship. Isabella began to understand that our bond was based on choice rather than mere biology, and it seemed to make her love even stronger. She also began to show more interest in her Spanish heritage, asking me to teach her what little of the language I knew, and requesting stories about Spain from the few travelers who passed through our settlement. As Isabella entered her 8th year, I began to face a new challenge, her education. She had far exceeded my ability to teach her, and the local school, while adequate for basic literacy, could not provide the advanced learning she craved. I knew that if I truly wanted what was best for her, I would need to send her away to one of the established schools in Boston, or even back to England. The thought filled me with dread. Isabella had become not just my daughter, but my closest companion, the center of my world. I could not imagine daily life without her bright chatter, her endless questions, her warm embrace when I returned from work in the fields. But love, I had learned, sometimes required sacrifice. If Isabella was to reach her full potential, she would need opportunities I could not provide in our isolated chapel home. I began making inquiries, writing letters to schools and academies, setting aside money for tuition and board. Each step in the process felt like preparing for my own execution, but I was determined to do right by the child who had saved my soul. It was Isabella herself who provided the solution. "Papa," she said one day as we walked through the forest gathering berries, "I've been thinking about school." My heart sank. Had she somehow sensed my plans? "What about school, little one?" "I know you think I need to go away to learn more," she said, her voice matter of fact. "But I don't want to leave you. You're my family." I stopped walking and knelt down to her level. "Isabella, you're the most important thing in my life. But I want you to have every opportunity to become the remarkable woman I know you can be." "Can't I be remarkable right here?" she asked. "With you?" Her simple question forced me to reconsider everything. Who had decided that formal education in a distant city was the only path to a meaningful life? Isabella was already more learned than most adults in our community. She spoke 2 languages, read voraciously, and displayed wisdom beyond her years. Perhaps what she needed was not more schooling, but more life experience. I made a decision that would shape the remainder of our story together. Instead of sending Isabella away, I would expand our world to include her. We would travel, meet new people, experience different cultures. I would use my connections from my military days to introduce her to scholars, artists, and thinkers who could nurture her intellectual gifts. Over the next several years, we became something unique in colonial society, a father and daughter team of wandering scholars. We would spend part of each year at our chapel home, tending to our obligations in Millbrook, and part traveling throughout the colonies and even across the Atlantic to Europe. Isabella thrived in this unconventional education. She learned French in Quebec, studied mathematics with Jesuit priests in Maryland, and debated philosophy with professors at Harvard College. Her mixed heritage, which might have been a liability in a traditional setting, became an asset in our travels. She could move easily between different cultural communities, adapting her behavior and speech to fit whatever situation we encountered. But it was not just Isabella who grew during these journeys. I, too, was transformed by our experiences together. The bitter, guilt-ridden man who had sought refuge in a forgotten chapel was gradually replaced by someone who found joy in discovery, in learning, in the simple pleasure of sharing the world with someone he loved. Isabella's questions, which had once seemed endless, became the starting point for my own intellectual renaissance. Through her eyes, I rediscovered wonder at the complexity of creation, the beauty of human achievement, the endless possibilities that lay before anyone brave enough to pursue them. When Isabella was 12, we encountered something that would change our understanding of her origins forever. We were in Williamsburg, Virginia, where I had been invited to lecture on military engineering at the College of William and Mary. Isabella was attending a soiree hosted by the wife of the colonial governor when she was approached by an elderly Spanish nobleman visiting from Mexico. Don Carlos de Mendoza was a man of obvious wealth and refinement, but what caught Isabella's attention was his reaction upon seeing her. He stared at her with an expression of shock that bordered on recognition. "Forgive me, señorita," he said in accented English, "but you remind me remarkably of someone I once knew. Might I ask your family name?" "Blackwood," Isabella replied confidently. "Isabella Blackwood." The old man's face went pale. "Blackwood. Are you certain? You have no Spanish ancestry?" I intervened at that point, sensing that we were approaching dangerous ground. "I am Isabella's father," I said firmly. "Perhaps you are thinking of someone else." But Don Carlos was not easily dissuaded. He requested a private meeting the following day, during which he revealed information that shook me to my core. "The child you call Isabella," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I believe she may be my granddaughter. My daughter, Maria Elena de Mendoza, disappeared from our family estate in Mexico nearly 15 years ago. She was with child, the result of a liaison with an English merchant that my wife and I could not accept. We were harsh in our judgment. She fled rather than face our anger. He showed me a miniature portrait of his daughter, and the resemblance to Isabella was unmistakable. The same dark eyes, the same delicate features, the same proud bearing. If what you say is true, I said carefully, then Isabella is your granddaughter. But she is also my daughter. I have raised her since she was barely 2 years old. Don Carlos nodded slowly. I can see the love between you. I would not seek to destroy that bond. But I would like to know her, if you will permit it. And perhaps she would like to know something of her mother's family as well. It was a delicate situation, but one that ultimately enriched Isabella's life immeasurably. Don Carlos became a grandfather to her in truth, sharing stories of her mother's childhood, teaching her about Mexican culture and history, and eventually arranging for her to visit the family estates in New Spain. Isabella learned that her mother had been a woman of great intelligence and independence, traits that had put her at odds with the rigid expectations of Spanish colonial society. She had come to the English colonies seeking freedom to live and love as she chose, but had died in childbirth, alone and far from everything she had known. She left me with you because she knew you would love me, Isabella said, after hearing the full story. She couldn't have known you personally, but somehow she recognized something in you that told her I would be safe. The mystery of how her mother had known to leave Isabella at the chapel was never fully solved, but it no longer seemed to matter. What mattered was the family we had built together, and the love that had grown from that first moment when I had found a freezing child and chosen to save her life. Isabella continued to grow and flourish, becoming a young woman of remarkable accomplishment. She spoke 5 languages, had studied at some of the finest institutions in Europe and the Americas, and displayed talents in everything from mathematics to music to natural philosophy. But more than her intellectual achievements, she had developed into a person of deep compassion and moral strength. When she was 18, Isabella announced her intention to return to our chapel home and establish a school for children of mixed heritage, those who, like herself, might not fit easily into the rigid categories of colonial society. I want to give them what you gave me, Papa, she said. Love, acceptance, and the chance to become who they're meant to be. It was a fitting culmination to our journey together. The abandoned child who had been saved by a broken knight had grown into a woman determined to save others in turn. I am an old man now, my hair white as the snow that had nearly claimed Isabella's life so many years ago. She is a mother herself, with children who call me grandfather, and fill the chapel with the same joyful noise that once echoed from Isabella's own childhood games. The school she founded has become renowned throughout the colonies, drawing students from as far away as the Caribbean islands and the Spanish territories. Isabella's example has shown that love knows no boundaries of race or class, that a family can be built from choice as surely as from blood. As I watch her working with her students, I am struck by the miracle of redemption. I came to the new world as a man running from his past, seeking only oblivion. Instead, I found purpose, love, and a future I could never have imagined. The child who was abandoned in a frozen chapel became the salvation of a fallen knight. But perhaps more accurately, we saved each other. In choosing to love her, I discovered that I was still capable of love. In accepting that love, she learned that she was worthy of it. It was never about blood or birth or the circumstances that brought us together. It was about choice. The choice to see beyond appearances, to love without condition, to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of what came before. Isabella once asked me if I ever regretted the life I might have lived if I had not found her that morning. The question surprised me because I had never considered it a choice at all. From the moment I saw her lying in that basket, blue with cold, but still breathing, still hoping, there was never any other path I could have taken. She was my daughter from that first moment, just as I became her father. Everything else was simply the working out of what was already written in our hearts. That is the story I wanted to tell, not just of an abandoned child and the man who saved her, but of how salvation works in mysterious ways, how love can grow in the most unlikely places, and how sometimes the family we choose becomes more real than the one we were born into. The chapel still stands, though it has been expanded many times to accommodate Isabella's school. Sometimes, On quiet winter evenings, I sit before the same fireplace where I first warmed her tiny body, and I remember that morning when everything changed. I think about the woman who left her daughter in the snow, trusting that someone would find her and love her. I think about the divine providence that brought me to that place at that moment. I think about all the small choices and chances that had to align perfectly for our story to unfold as it did. And I give thanks for the abandoned child who taught a fallen knight that redemption is always possible, that love is always stronger than regret, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with a quest or a battle, but with the simple decision to care for someone who needs you. Isabella Blackwood de Mendoza, for she eventually took both names, honoring all the families that had claimed her, became one of the most remarkable women of her generation. But to me, she will always be the frightened child I found in the snow, who looked up at me with trust in her dark eyes and changed the course of both our lives forever. That is the power of love, the miracle of family, the hope that keeps us going even in the darkest winters. Sometimes when we least expect it, when we feel most lost and alone, grace appears in the form of someone who needs us as much as we need them, and in saving them, we discover that we have saved ourselves.
If this story touched you, don't leave without subscribing. Every week, a new, intense, and unexpected tale awaits you here on Tales of the Forgotten Heart.